let's get back into some dose of the serum. It's been a while, but I'm gonna give us something to talk about before I start putting out some more analyses, like a week from now or so. Um, let's just get straight into it. I'll talk about some the recent events in the past few weeks, boxing related. Maybe go outside of boxing a little bit, but I don't know. We'll see where we go from where I'm gonna start. I'll start with Fatal Fury, and then kind of bridge into some other stuff. Talk about Inoue, talk about little guys and resumes and eye test and all of that. All right, Fatal Fury. One of the bigger kind of takeaways from that card, other than the performances themselves, is and also connected to Canelo and Williams' goal. There's kind of three goals that are at play for a boxer or prize fighter or entertainer, or not entertainer, but a fighter of any sort. Three goals: for one, to entertain, because your job is to sell tickets. Second, to win, because you're a competitor, and of course, if you're a competitor, your goal is to win the competition. And third, to stay safe, because you're a man and you want to live a long and prosperous life. Now, sometimes one can conflict with two, or two can conflict with one, and then you have an issue. Because if you're just focused on winning and staying safe, uh, a lot of times that means you won't take risks. And I've always said that taking risk is like the key to I'll say one of the two keys to having an entertaining fight. I think, and we'll talk more about this with Ben versus Eubank. I think as far as the most entertaining fights go, again, it's probably about three things. One is stakes. There's a lot at stake, and a lot of that comes from beyond what's happening in the ring. There's a lot of history, there's belts, so on and so forth. Two is the fighters are taking risk and they're putting themselves in danger. And the third, which is probably the most important, is the danger itself. People are getting hurt, or they can get hurt. Every moment has you on the edge of your seat because it could be the end. But if you're risk adverse for the sake of your health, or for the sake of just getting the safest win possible and not trying to take any risks that could potentially take away from you getting the win, I think at that point you're going to be sacrificing the entertainment value. Now, the optimal scenario is you don't have to sacrifice any of them. That's not, it depends on how good you are, how dominant you are, but that's, we don't always get that. Keyshawn Davis is on the screen, and he's both entertaining, highly skilled, he's vicious, but he also stays safe. He doesn't get hit clean too often, and he definitely wins. Terrence Crawford is another example. A lot of the top guys kind of have that. If you look at the big three, Crawford, Inoue, Usyk, all in mostly entertaining fights. They're very rarely in boring fights, if at all. And they have the entertainment value. They get active. They take risks. They put on good performances. They win. For the most part, they stay safe. Now, they can get hurt a little bit, but they're not getting into like just outright brawls where they're getting blasted. So, generally, if you are dominant and skilled enough, you don't have to make much of a choice, because you can kind of do it all. And as soon as I say that, Rod Tang is on the screen. Rod Tang safety. Sometimes he is focused on safety, but sometimes he'll just get hit in the face. Depends. Rod Tang is a Muay Thai fighter, for those of you that don't know. Fighters do have an obligation to the fans because that's who pays their bills, but simultaneously they have an obligation to themselves and families, because those are the two things you're supposed to protect in this world. You always have to protect yourself, because if you can't protect yourself, then you can't protect anything else. So that comes first. But then once you're able to handle taking care of yourself, then you take care of the people that matter most to you. And so in that sense, there's always the the counter argument to fighters. Let's take Devin Haney and William Skull, for example. Devin Haney had a relatively dominant performance, like a 12-0 victory, 11-1, whatever. And he did what a lot of people would call running. I would call it running. In fact, we could talk about that. William Skull is an even better example. Because there's going to be criticism, but then there's also going to be nuance. That's the thing about this channel. We're not just about criticizing, and we're not just about giving credit. We're about doing both in the proper apportionment to which it's deserved. And in order to do that, you have to be nuanced, which means you can't just see things as black and white. And maybe we'll get into that as well. There's some very interesting conversations, but those are much tougher conversations, and those will make some people upset. But sometimes that's just, in boxing, that's just gonna happen. So if you take Devin Haney, for example, there are a lot of reasons why he fought the way he fought. One is he's facing a dangerous fighter. But he's faced dangerous fighters before, and he never really fought like that. So it's not just that. Two is he's coming off a brutal beating, and his confidence probably isn't all there. That's also a big factor. Three is maybe he wanted to be safe enough to where he could ensure that I just got to get this victory, get back on my feet, and not really worry about all the other stuff. I just got to get this victory. So he's just focused on getting the job done, and he's not really focused on the entertainment value, and he's not focused on having the most dominant victory possible. He's like, let me do precisely all that I need to do to get the job done and nothing more. So those are kind of three surface level things that I think contribute to that. And I think that those are all fair reasons. Like, I frankly don't really disparage Devin Haney for the performance, even though I think it's running. And here's how I define running. If somebody's moving to create space and set up shots, and they're moving for the purpose of controlling range, controlling distance, so that they can actually try to do damage or try to land meaningful punches, that's not running. Running is just as much about the actual action as it is about the intent behind it. So if somebody is moving around the ring at all times just to escape, and they're doing the bare minimum they have to, you know, basically have a fight, like something, I wouldn't even say a fight. They're doing the bare minimum to just like stay in the fight and kind of win to the degree that they can with that style. I would consider that running, because running is counterintuitive to fighting. And if you're running just to shut down the fight and you're not doing much besides that, yeah, that's running. And William Skull is a pretty good example. And you know what? You can actually have a lot of success in terms of scoring doing that style. But at that point, you have to think about what you're incentivizing for the sport. Like, if you praise that style, let's say that you even like that style. See, there's so many practical elements to this too. Let's say that I really like the style in which a fighter is just laterally moving, jumping, moving around, and throwing like 5 punches around. Let's say I really like that style. Well, let's say I also want the sport to do better, have more fans, make more money, have more boxers come in, more talent. Having that at the forefront of the sport, having that be the most successful style, the most common style, that is a complete anathema to the goal of having boxing succeed. Because boxing isn't built on stuff like that. Boxing is built on stuff like Benn versus Eubank. And now that doesn't mean every fight should be like that. In fact, most fights shouldn't be like that, because that's what makes a fight like that special, the fact that it's exceptional. But I think if you set that as the standard, the sport will corrode. It will slowly dissolve because people don't come to boxing to see that. They don't. They come to boxing to see. Sometimes most people don't really care about the skill that much. They might pretend like they do. They want to see two fighters that just so happen to be skilled. And then maybe more advanced fans want to see two skilled athletes that just so happen to be fighters. But regardless, the fighting is a part of the equation. And when you take that out, boxing doesn't have much to give. Now, there's still a skill aspect. It takes a lot of skill and definitely a lot of cardio to pull that off. But it takes a lot of skill and a lot of cardio to pull off the type of style in UFC where you just hold on to your opponent and just try and hold them down and do as little fighting as possible. But that shouldn't be incentivized either, because that also kills that sport. At the end of the day, like how I said earlier, the entertainment is about taking risk, it's about danger, and it's about stakes. If there's no danger and no risk, what do you have? You have boring stuff. And also like how I said, probably the first thing that comes is entertainment. If we're gonna be honest here, boxing is only as successful as the amount of pay-per-views, eyes, and seats that it can generate and bring. So I think that also has to be factored in. But Devin Haney, I think I'm empathetic to why he fought the way that he fought, and I don't think it was a horrific performance. I thought it was very boring. I almost fell asleep, but like I could understand why he fought that way. And he doesn't really fight that way that often. So as long as he doesn't make a habit out of fighting that way, I'm not really caught up on it. I'm not somebody that really obsesses over things like that and just holds it against the fighters, because they're human and they do things for a reason. And he got absolutely battered. So I'm sure that was staying with him. And to be fair, he did it against Jose Ramirez, he had 2 belts at 140, I think, at one point. And I think Josh Taylor took both of them. He either had 1 and Josh Taylor had 3, or I'm pretty sure he had 2. But regardless, yeah, Jose Ramirez is a damn good fighter, and Devin Haney was able to outclass him. So I think he deserves credit for that. But yeah, he was running. And I do think that's a bad thing, and I do think that should be acknowledged. And I do think it's the fans' job to look at a fighter doing a non-entertaining thing and call them out for not being entertaining, because a boxer is not just a fighter, they are a prize fighter. The prize is the money, and the money comes from people who want to be entertained. If you are not entertaining them, you're not a prize fighter. And if you're not fighting, you're not a fighter. So, but yeah, that doesn't mean that movement is bad. Movement is key, but movement isn't the only key. When it is the only key, you're leaving a lot of doors locked, especially monetary ones. But William Skull, on the other hand, I think it was an even more pernicious example of that style taking place. I was watching some of that, and sometimes I was just tuning out because I'm like, oh, no, I'm not gonna watch this. But yeah, William was just there to be there, and he knew going into the decision that he wasn't gonna win. And even technically, if he's like outpointing Canelo at times, if you're like barely throwing anything behind your punches and then just trying to leave, you throw like a little barely snappy punch and then try and leave. It's like, if we're mainly judging a fight based off of intent because there's not much action, the person with the intent to actually hurt the other person and is actually trying to fight, I think that should be rewarded far more than the person who's trying to shut down the fight. But boxing scoring is weird in that way because in one sense you have to balance what scoring is in terms of just who's more effective. And then in another sense, you kind of have to incentivize certain behaviors. Those are kind of the two biggest facets of a scoring system. It's about outlining what's effective and incentivizing how the fighters or what the fighters should focus on. And like in the UFC, they're even making changes to some of the grounded opponent rules, for example, to de-incentivize fighters to put their hands on the ground in such a way that they can just be invincible for that period of time. Now it's like, no, we're not gonna let you abuse that rule, and you can be hurt. I guess I shouldn't say scoring. I guess I should say rules. Rules are about incentivizing certain behaviors and outlining scoring. But yeah, as far as the rules are concerned, there's an interesting conversation being made about running and what to do about it, and how much of a big deal is it, and if you can effectively penalize it in such a way that it hurts actual runners and doesn't hurt people who are moving for the purpose of actually trying to win a fight and not just escape one. But that's such a gray area, and a lot of times it's hard to distinguish, but sometimes it isn't. So yeah, that's a whole conversation. Maybe we'll talk more about that in the future, but we talked about it in the past. I think Teofimo Lopez versus Jamel Ortiz. So I don't remember what I said there, but you can look that up. Benn versus Eubank is an interesting example of the trio goals that we talked about, because I think a lot of times the most entertaining fights are coming from fighters who aren't even thinking about being entertaining. They're so focused on the stakes at hand, trying to prove something to themselves and maybe to someone else in this instance, that they're willing to take the risk, and they're willing to put themselves in danger, and they're definitely willing to be dangerous. And I think that's what Benn versus Eubank was. But also when we look at the kind of the trio of important things to make an entertaining fight, we can start kind of outward looking in. The stakes. No belts. Both of them don't really even fight at that division. Eubank had moved up at Conor Benn. I don't know if he'd ever fought at 160. Prior to that moment, he had fought at 154. I don't know if he'd ever fought at 160. So this fight on paper means nothing. But we're going to talk about the illusions of paper later on and how paper is overrated. But we'll get there. On paper, it means nothing, but with context, it means everything, particularly to the two men that are in the ring. It's about legacy. It's about history. It's about family. It's about the archetype of the son who comes from the background in which they don't have to prove themselves. They're always under the pressure that they feel like they have to. That's a very interesting archetype. But yeah, the two fathers who are legends in their country, and to an extent legends in boxing, and probably should be more so internationally, but definitely in the UK, legends. And to me, I've talked about this in a couple other videos, but to me, just the build up, two very contrary personalities, two different histories, two different fighting styles, two different fathers. It's just like their fathers in so many ways. It was just so much building up to this, fights being canceled, people popping for drugs, people going through trauma publicly, people having issues with their fathers publicly. Like, there's so much drama. And then the WWE moment when Chris Eubank gets out of the senior gets out of the car, and I'm like, what it's so much that went into that fight that made it what it was. But one of the things that makes fights legendary, if people don't talk about it a lot because they just focus on the fight, is all of the stuff that happens before and after the fight. Joe Frazier versus Muhammad Ali isn't just a classic because of how good the fight is. There's also the hatred between them being on the talk show and Ali being like, sit down quick, Joe. All the stuff, all the trash talk, the stare downs, the face offs, everything. That's why whenever there's a movie about fighting, a particularly iconic one like Creed or Rocky, most of the focus is about leading up to the fight. Then the fight means something, because ultimately what makes fights beautiful is that they're volatile stories being told. And stories mean so much more when you're attached to the characters, because then you're invested. And when you're invested, every punch that lands means so much more, and every punch that misses means so much more. Everything means so much more because you have an attachment to everything that's happening. Benn versus Eubank is so interesting because it has all the stakes, all the history, and when they get in there, instantly they swinging bombs. So risk is there, and Eubank gets rocked, so danger is there, and eventually Conor Benn starts getting rocked in the lane later round, so danger is there for him. It's back and forth, him getting rocked, him getting caught with a big shot, him backing up, him coming forward, swinging, boom, fast, heavy. And the skill for both of them wasn't necessarily up to par, but I'm a firm believer that as far as art is concerned, there's a time to watch Godzilla versus King Kong, and then there's a time to watch Interstellar. I don't think one type of art is inferior to the other just because of the depth and complexity. But that's also how I look at fights. I can just as much enjoy a fight where two dudes is brawling, Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler, and there's like all kinds of violence, people getting knocked down, and you can look at the defense, be like, what the hell? He don't got no guard. He not moving his head. He got no footwork. His punches look sloppy, but it's like, it's a fight though, and that's still very entertaining, still very beautiful to watch, because there are a lot of internal things that are happening when you're breathing heavy, blood coming out your nose is busted, so you're breathing through your mouth, your ribs bruised. You got a broken orbital, and so now it becomes about your character, about your toughness, about your durability, both physical and mental. And that's just as beautiful as watching a high skill fight where you have two technicians that are making these adjustments back and forth, and he's adjusting there and he's adjusting there, and he's setting them up with this jab to the body, and he's doing this, and he's breaking them down, and setting up the traps. So you have to be able to appreciate both. Like, that's the beauty of life, is that beauty doesn't come in one shape or size. Beauty can look like the highest skill possible, or it can look like a brawl. But you have to be able to recognize the beauty in both. And so while the skill for both wasn't necessarily all there, everything else was. The emotion, the hatred, the competitiveness, the fatherly love, um, the history, the danger, everything, everything. And then you think about, okay, staying safe. Staying safe because that's very important. At the end of the day, and this is what I was going to say earlier, but I cut myself off, which is strange because I'm the only one talking. But my thoughts kind of go in different directions and I have to like pick one track. Staying safe is always a great counter argument against the entertainment angle because people make a great point that where are the fans for Richard Colin, Gerald McClellan, all these fighters that took excessive damage from their fights? Some because they weren't necessarily staying as safe as they could have been, and some just because of some messed up stuff that happened. But regardless, when the fighters are broken and battered from putting on the entertaining fights that the fans desire, where are the fans? A lot of times they're not really anywhere to be found, at least nowhere near the same qualities that they were to be found when the fighters had something to offer them. And so I do think that should not be overlooked. And in watching Benn versus Eubank in like round 11 and 12, I'm like, this is the type of fight where motherfuckers walk away with a lot of damage. Those are career-altering fights, sometimes life-altering fights. But there's a lot to be said about staying safe because, to me, the most important thing you can do to stay safe is what you do in sparring. Because fighters spar far more than they fight in the ring under the lights. But if they take in all those heavy shots in sparring, that accumulates to a far greater degree than what they'll ever do in the ring under the lights, because they'll be sparring 5 to 10 times more than the amount that they actually go into the ring and take heavy shots. That's one thing. I think another thing is fighters, of course, shouldn't make it a habit of getting into wars. But frankly, in the Benn versus Eubank example, if you have one of those fights on your resume, that stuff supersedes your name and the rest of your resume. It's just attached to you for the rest of time, and you're etched into history, and you become legend. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier are both legends, but would they be legends to the same extent if they didn't have their great fights? No. Now, Ali, of course, is Ali. He's always going to be a legend for everything that he's done, not just the fights with Joe Frazier, but still, that fight by itself, it carries weight. Eubank and Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn, their fights and their rivalry, it carries weight, irregardless of how legendary they are. And I think that's all. I won't say that's an underrated aspect of goals, but it's kind of like the fourth sneaky one. Legacy. What do you leave behind? And at the very least, they'll leave that behind. They left a part of themselves behind with it, but that's kind of the sacrifice that you make. That's a sacrifice that you make. And you gotta ask, is being legendary worth some of your life force? That's the question. And being a legend in the right space lasts longer than your career. So it puts you in position to be something for the rest of your life, potentially. Especially if you save up your money. But yeah, that can be quite different in some cultures, because the UK shows great appreciation for its legends like Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn and so on and so forth. Not to say that America doesn't, but America's a lot more fickle in many aspects, probably because we just have so many stars and some cultural reasons as well. But yeah, we have so many stars. We have Mike Tyson's and Floyd Mayweather's and Muhammad Ali's and Michael Phelps and Michael Jordan's and Michael Jackson's and LeBron James and so on and so forth. You could go down the list of all of the just icons that we have, and so it's not as much appreciation to go around to that in that degree. But I don't know if that's necessarily a good excuse. That's just the reason that I can put forth. Okay, we'll switch it up and talk about a more controversial take that I have. But I'll go into explaining why I have this take. But it's based off of Inoue versus Cardenas. Cardenas. I feel like I'm still mispronouncing his name. Cardenas. I've always said that people will look at box rec, or they'll just look at resumes and they'll be like, oh, I don't know this fighter, I don't know that fighter, oh, I've never heard of this dude, and then they'll kind of like judge it based off that, which is obviously as surface level as it gets. But like, what can you expect when people don't really care to put in effort to actually judge things? Like, they'll judge things, but the judgment is just as basic as it gets. That's because it's easy. That's the easy way to do things. Like, just with that, if I don't know enough, I just say I don't know enough and I don't have an opinion. That's one of the most important things I think I do in daily life. If I don't know much, I don't have much to say. That will save so many people from being stupid and looking stupid. But yeah, I've talked about in the past how eye test supersedes what's on paper, like I was hinting at earlier. Fights matter, but watching the fights themselves matters the most. And it's not even close. Like, I can look at names all day and I can look at records, but what does that mean? Like what do I really know? I just know numbers at that point. I'm like, oh, this guy is 15-0 and he beat this guy that's 12-0, and this guy that's 12-0 beat this guy that was 3-0. It's like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Here's my take. Little guys like 135 and below have been the most consistently talented possibly of all time, but definitely in the past 30-40 years, I want to say. I don't know how far I would stretch it back because I'm not a good boxing historian, but I'm just looking at how good they've been in the 2000s, at least up until through the 2020s. Like, in the 2000s, there was kind of a vacuum of boxing talent, especially in the bigger divisions. 175 up to heavyweight. And here's kind of my reasoning for why that might be, that those little guys are so consistently good. I think, for one, there aren't too many outlets for them. Medium-sized guys and bigger guys have so many sports to go to. Little guys are so much more limited. If you're, 5'8", 5'9", there's so many sports you could do. Hockey, international football, American football. If you start getting taller, you can do more American football, different positions. And this is for like athletes. If you get real big, you can do NBA and stuff like that. There's so many options for normal sized dudes and bigger dudes. So like middleweight up to heavyweight. There's so many great athletes that are in other sports that could have potentially been in combat sports or boxing. Little guys, on the other hand, are so much more limited in terms of all the other stuff that they can get into. So to a certain extent, they kind of are much more locked into combat sports as a pool of talent. Here's the real controversial take. To me, when I look at the fighters, and I look at the fighters that the fighters are fighting, Inoue has the most impressive resume based on the eye test. Now, I look at the quality of the opponents, and the first thing that stands out are the attributes. So I'm kind of going to go down what I'm seeing whenever I'm looking at these fighters' opponents. Like, to me, there's the big three. I've said this for over a year now, probably. Usyk, Crawford, Inoue. Now, all of them, just watching them fight, just ridiculously skilled, good athletes. They got it all. They got it all. They can, all three of them can do almost anything that they want. All of them got great resumes beating great opponents. But if I'm watching a fight and I'm watching a fighter for the first time, especially, I'm kind of gauging a lot of different things. And I'm doing it quite fast, and a lot of times I'm not even recognizing that I'm doing it because it's like in the background, just processing stuff. The first thing that stands out are the attributes. And I'm going to use Cardenas as an example. Stand out, I'm looking at the attributes, for example, reflexes, speed, athletic ability, power, toughness, durability. And I start checking off boxes. Maybe some boxes don't get checked, some of them do. And then I'm looking at the basic skills: guard, defensive reactions, footwork, punch technique, jab, accuracy. So one thing that's weird is with punch technique, for example, there are some pretty damn good fighters that sometimes have horrific technique. Like Tyson Fury, a lot of times his punch technique is so flabby and, I won't say unconventional, I'll just say like flat out inefficient. But he's so skilled regardless of that kind of issue in one of his skill areas that it doesn't really matter. Like my whole point there is that punch technique is just a facet of skills, but it's not necessarily representative of all the skills. There's some fighters that their punches technically are not very sound, but they're very skilled. So even if I see somebody with bad punch technique, I'm not necessarily going to write them off as not skilled. I'm like, let me see what they're actually doing. And that's where we get to the advanced stuff: counters, feints, setups, traps, patience, reads, and pattern recognition. Now, if I see somebody adapting to patterns fast, I'm like, ooh, this dude, he might be good. If I see somebody using feints to set up traps, I'm like, okay, yeah, he's got it as far as skill is concerned. And generally, if somebody's doing all that advanced stuff, they're at least good in terms of their basic attributes, and they're generally quite good in the basic skills. But another thing is, some very skilled fighters have like no guard. They have nothing there, but that's their style. That's how they prefer to fight. But I don't necessarily knock them just because defensively they have a lot of openings. To a degree, some fighters will purposely leave openings so that they can punish people for trying to take advantage of it. But looking at Cardenas, and this is what I can remember way back then, just off the top of my head, stuff that I documented. And what's funny is he was a Lyft driver, and I didn't know that until after the fight. So I don't come in with the preconceived notion that, oh, he's a Lyft driver, he's trash. For one, I assumed he was a good fighter because he's fighting Inoue. Just like I would assume that if somebody's fighting Terrence Crawford, they're probably a good fighter. If someone's fighting Usyk, they're probably a good fighter. I say probably, almost certainly a good fighter. If you're fighting one of the best fighters in the world, it doesn't matter if you were a plumber. It doesn't matter if you fix lights. It doesn't matter what you were doing as a part-time job or whatever. If you can fight, you can fight. End of story. And so I'm looking at Cardenas, and I see he's patient and disciplined, and I'm like, okay, Those are positive attributes. Um, because, well, we'll get into why that's positive in a second. And then I see some adaptation pretty early on. He's adapting his jab to have less telegraph. His technique is actually kind of matching Inoue, because Inoue throws his jab in such a way that his hand is a little bit lowered and it's a little bit already partially extended, and he doesn't really turn the jab over. He shoots it up and mostly straight, almost a vertical jab, and it slices through the guard for one, and it has almost no telegraph, and he's already damn fast. So that jab is extremely hard to deal with. And I see Cardenas start kind of partially matching that technique, and he's kind of moving with Inoue, and he's jabbing with him, and so they kind of are having a jab battle. And so I see him making the adaptation. I'm like, oh, this boy, he may be good. Then I'm looking at his guard, not just the fact that he has one, but I see that it's durable, it's holding up, boom, 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 boom. I see him holding up under the straight punches. And then I see him adjusting to kind of turn his elbows with the body shot, and kind of turning to catch shots coming around. And I'm like, okay, that's another positive attribute, because he's not just sitting there like this. He doesn't have a static high guard. He actually has an adjustable high guard where he's responding accordingly and not just standing there like a punching bag. So more positive stuff. Then I really start to think he's even better when I see him trying to bait Inoue to come in so he can counter him. And that's part of his patience. So he's purposefully giving Inoue stuff to bring him in so he can try and swing that left hook. And that's a big plus. If I see somebody actually thinking and not just doing, I'm like, this is a good fighter. Almost certainly this is a good fighter. That's a big deal. If you see someone thinking and not just doing, that is a very big deal. Because on the surface level, that seems like that should be super common, but it's not as common as you would think. And then I see him consistently trying to set up that left hook counter, but it's a little bit predictable and a little bit repetitive, but at least he's trying to set up. But at the same time, I'm kind of thinking, okay, maybe he's quite basic in that regard. Like, he doesn't have much in that bag, but at least he has something in that bag. And so that's a positive. But at the same time, I am weighing that in my head, like, okay, he's not like a world beater, because if he was a world beater, he would have even more to bring out and set up. So that now I'm kind of adding nuance to it. I see the positives, but I also see some relatively basic stuff. So it's not just, pure glaze. Then I see the combos, him trying to get underneath and around the guard with the body shots, throw the hooks around the guard and like set up the combo. So I'm like, okay, that's a positive, because now I'm looking at the diversity and variability of his style. He can do single shots from the outside, or he can kind of close the distance and throw combos on the inside and adjust to try and find openings in the guard. So I'm like, okay, he has variability to his style. That's also a plus. Then I see him back foot boxing a little, and to the contrary of that, some front foot aggression as well. So again, I'm seeing that he can do multiple things. He's not one dimensional. So that's a big plus as well, because a lot of fighters are one dimensional. So he's already showing me a lot of stuff that's impressing me. And I don't know anything about this guy. I'd never heard of him prior to Inoue. I didn't know he was a Lyft driver. I don't even think I necessarily knew his record by like the number. I think it was like 26-0, but I think when I saw the record on the screen, like 26-0, I think it was 14 KOs. I'm like, oh, he probably don't hit that. I was thinking he don't hit that hard. So that was also wrong, because once he started throwing the punches, I saw the velocity. I'm like, oh shit, this dude fast. And so I'm like, he looked dangerous. And it turned out that he was. So records can be deceiving. The thing about KOs is that they're just as much a function of your style as they are your power. Some fighters don't have crazy single punch power, but they will put on so much pressure and drown people that they have nothing but stoppages. Subriel Matias, Artur Beterbiev, David Benavidez, all good examples of people that aren't just, Mike Tyson coming in, pop, just hitting you with one shot. You know, they aren't Terrence Crawford, just boom, uppercut, you're done. They're not Naoya Inoue, just left hook, you're out. They don't have that pure one punch power. What they do have is the ability to break you down. And stylistically, they get so many KOs because of that. So just because he didn't have a great KO percentage, that does not necessarily mean that he doesn't have power, and then he proved that. Yeah, so he proved that because eventually that left hook that he was repetitively throwing, even though I criticized that for being so repetitive and partially one-dimensional in that aspect, eventually he baited him into that counter like how he's been trying to do, walked him into it, boom. And so I'm looking at all the skills, all the small stuff he's doing, obviously the attributes as well, and I'm judging him based off that. I don't know anything else about him. I just know what I can see, and what I can measure. Because if you just look at the numbers, like, there's not much you can measure. It's like, okay, it seems like he's undefeated and maybe he beat one or two undefeated guys, so good, I guess. But like, you don't really know much. There's not much you can say or do based off of that information. But if you collect all that data of looking at how they actually perform, now you can judge the quality of that fighter, and then you can judge the quality of the opponent in terms of how it fits on the more important fighter's resume, or the more respected fighter's resume. Now, before I ever look at a resume, I look at all those things, because what you do in the ring is the ultimate judge of what you can do in the ring. Now that sounds very straightforward, and that's because it is. Like, the reason why people look at box rec or they look at resumes is to try and judge how good a fighter is in the ring. The best judge of how a fighter is in the ring is by judging how they are in the ring. And that's my point. Which, again, that doesn't mean that paper isn't helpful. I would say paper helps paint a bigger picture, but big pictures mean nothing without the intricate details. So, since Inoue is in these smaller divisions, he has the advantage of consistently facing elite competition. At the very least, they're elite in terms of skill level. A lot of times they're also elite in terms of just their physical attributes as well. Very fast, great reflexes. Some of them hit hard, some of them don't. You know, there's stuff like that. But of course, little guys are gonna have better reflexes and more speed, and the bigger guys are gonna be stronger and heavier and hit harder. So, you know, there's trade-offs. But the thing about the reflexes and speed is that generally that's more conducive to helping out with skill than power is. What I mean by that is, if somebody's very fast but they don't hit that hard, they're gonna be more like a Guillermo Rigondeaux or a Pernell Whitaker or a Stephen Fulton or Floyd Mayweather. They're gonna have to rely more on skill because they're not gonna be able to get you out of there. And then that's gonna get into my next point, which is that little guys are forced to be more skillful because there's less knockouts. Less knockouts means fights become less and less about luck and landing the right shot, and more about being better for 30 to 36 minutes. In order to outclass someone for half an hour, you have to have superior skills in one area at least. Range control, pattern recognition, timing, traps, feints, cutting the ring off, counters. Something has to be superior, and generally outclassing means you're superior in almost all of those areas that matter. But now we're kind of coming full circle, because that brings up a great point about outclassing someone. If you can outclass someone, should you just do the safe thing and carefully pick at them until the bell rings, the final bell? Or should you try and take some risk to make a statement? And I will leave that to you all down in the comments, because I think that's kind of the key thing. I think that's the key difference between what we saw in Fatal Fury and what we saw in Inoue versus Cardenas. That's how Inoue does in general. He never does the safe thing, and sometimes he should be safer, but he chooses to take the risk. He knows that he's far better than his opponents, and instead of just doing the least amount possible that he has to do to win, he does as much as he has to make a statement, to prove a point, to stop, drop, and finish his opponents. But you see how that worked out for him. He got dropped. So maybe he should be like Devin Haney and be safe and have a longer, healthier career. You know, I could represent both sides of the argument, and I do think there is an argument there. But I'm on one side more so than the other. You could probably tell based on the way that I've talked about everything in this video. So that's up to y'all to talk about. Should fighters who are levels above their opponents stay safe just to win, or take more risks to dominate and stop their opponents? That's what I'll have y'all discuss down below. But also, yeah, eventually I'm gonna get back into Duran versus Leonard. I may even speed that process up. Right now, James Toney versus Mike McCullum 1 is on Patreon for free. All you have to do is sign up and you will have access to it. No payments. Eventually I'm going to do Eubank versus Benn, and I may do Inoue versus Cardenas. I don't know. That one I'm not so sure about. We shall see. But yeah, more analysis coming in a week or so. But this should give you all a lot to think about in the meantime. And maybe I'll have some analysis out before a week. I don't know. But stay tuned. I'm out.